1, maybe they're married to a 5, an introvert, and then we're right away able to say to the 2, you have to have some compassion for him too, because, and it's usually male, female, not always, but the 2 is usually the female and the 5, the male. And we say, he feels like if he gives any more.
You're listening to Get Your Marriage On, the fun and spicy podcast bringing you new tools and fresh ideas so that you can be the sexiest couple you know.
Everybody, welcome to this episode of Get Your Marriage On. I am delighted to have as my guest today, Christa Hardin. She has a master's degree in psychology. She's a relationship coach and an Enneagram expert. Christa, welcome today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan. I'm so thankful to be here.
Great. How long have you been coaching relationships and stuff like that?
Well, unofficially since I was a little girl with my parents, and we know that parentified children are nothing to brag about, but I got started professionally when I was in my early 20s, just as soon as I could.
That's great. How long have you been married and what's your family like?
Well, I've been married to my husband, Wes, who is an Enneagram 1 since we were 21. And then we were actually high school sweethearts at 16 because he was also a parentified child. And so we found each other and we were like, oh my gosh, like, let's have fun together. We have 3 kids together, Hannah, Melody, and Jack, and they are 15 through 8. And we just have so much fun with them.
Cool. So people hear of the Enneagram because it seems to be really trendy and popular now. But how far back is Enneagram's roots?
It's an ancient typing system that has kind of obscure roots in even ancient times. So because it has this ancient mathematical part of it, we really don't know the exact origins. But what's nice about the Enneagram in terms of comparing it to Myers-Briggs and other popular typologies is that it actually has a sense of growing with time and over seasons. So it's quite rooted, but it's also nuanced enough to move with the current time. So that's been something different to bring to the personality typing world.
For someone that has absolutely no idea what you just said, Myers-Briggs, personality typing and everything, or even the word Enneagram, can you break that down real quick? We're talking about personalities here, right? And I understand Enneagram means like it's a 9-sided polygon, basically.
Yes. Yep. And so I'm so glad you reminded me of that. Sometimes I get in my head, I'm a type 7, which is one of the head types, but I'll explain that it's basically when you say Enneagram, you're talking about a personality typing system, and other personality typing systems that are popular are the Myers-Briggs, which does different letters for introversion and extroversion, etc.
And then ENFP.
Yep, me too. That's
nice.
Cool. And so then when we get to the Enneagram, we use types 1 through 9. And we have not just 9 types, but also subtypes. And then you can get more nuanced than that. So it's really very particular. And once you get down to several of the nuances, if, for instance, you're doing relationship coaching or you're a psychologist or anyone in the field, it gives you, I always say, an extra few months, almost pads you with some information about your clients or even your spouse, if you and your spouse are doing this together, to help you to learn about each other in a little bit of a quicker fashion. Does that make sense?
Yes. Can you give our listeners a quick overview of each of the 9 types? What are their qualities? That way, if you're listening, you're like, okay, I can start to identify myself and see myself in this story rather than just like, I don't know, getting lost for the rest of our conversation today.
Yes, I think that's such a good idea. So, and I actually will let you know, I'm going to start with 1 because Dan and I were talking about how we always start with, usually Enneagram people start with 8, but I just like to start at the beginning with 1. So type 1s are the people in the world who are typically self-described as perfectionists, but a little more gently described as reformers, people who want to help change the world and to fix things. And they might be somebody you might know somebody like this who says like, oh, I have a little change for you. Hold on, just get out of the way. Let me do that. And so they like to bring order and goodness to the world. And they often have a very deep sense of right and wrong. When you get to type 2, you have people who are known to be helpful and generous. And of course, 1s can be this way and so can everybody else. But this is really, type 2 is known as the befriender or the helper or the giver because they're so in that spirit all the time. That's what they want to do. And they're uncomfortable sometimes with being given to, because they like to be in that role of the helper. And I often see twos in the fields of teaching and also medicine, because they just give so sacrificially. So a lot of our healthcare heroes lately are twos. We also have threes, and threes are achievers or performers. They're people who like to be on the stage or the best in the class, and they're usually quite intelligent, and they often find their worth through their achievements. So they might say, what's the next goal? I have to hit it. They're very good at hitting goals. And sometimes they do deep down hope to be loved outside of those achievements, but sometimes they can even be the ones to say, hey, I'd really like to find people who look good to be with so that I can schmooze in a room. And they have to watch out for that so that they're more authentic and get to know themselves better. As you can see, there's so many layers to this, but this is the basics. So you might be hearing yourself saying, yeah, I really like achieving. That's how I found my identity a lot of the time. Type fours are very creative people. They are often melancholy because they like to go to the depths with people. Sometimes you see them in the counseling field because they can really hit those depths with their clients and they can stay there for a while instead of bouncing right back up or excusing it. And so they're just so gifted with seeing things in textures and depths. And in that, they're not often as fast paced as some of the other types because it takes a while to really sit with things. But they also really enjoy just the beauties of the world. And that's why some people refer to them as that, because they really care a lot about the arts and aesthetics. So we get to type 5, and now we have our typically introverted people who really like to be to themselves and save energy. And that's because 5s often don't have as much energy as the rest of the world. So these are people who are like, you know what, I think I'll stay back, or can we drive separately so that I don't have to go to the party and leave at the same time as you in case I get exhausted or overwhelmed. They are often the researchers or the IT people that prefer thoughts to feelings and really take time to process feelings. A lot of 5s that do therapy with their spouses usually say to me, their spouses actually usually say, oh, I love this because they'll never talk about this until we finally get with you, because they like to process thoughts, but they don't want to talk about feelings. They do have feelings deep down, but they haven't found them to be that adaptive. So they prefer the world of thoughts. So we also have 6s. 6s are troubleshooters and loyal friends, and they're very caring, and they will always look to see what's going to be the best way to stay safe in the world. And so they're that person you can see on an airplane with the big oversized purse, who's got the Band-Aids, who's got the big mom purse. And they're also just so kind because they'll share it with others. And it may sometimes be with that little bit of attitude like, I told you so, but they care so deeply and they will stay with their people. Sometimes they feel bad about themselves in as far as thinking about others a little bit better. So they will put others as very high up on their list. They will seek out resources from others before checking in with themselves. So some of their work is to do a gut check with themselves and to learn to trust themselves. Type 7s, which we talked a little bit about already. We've got 2 of them right here on the podcast, right, Dan? That one is so much fun because it is really all about being spontaneous, being enthusiastic, and being joyful. And so we like to share encouragement with others. And you also find a lot of us in the counseling and coaching world because of that. And people really desire refreshment. So often after my sessions, I'm sure you hear this too, Dan, you hear the word, that was so refreshing.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's a fun personality, but what a 7 does sometimes is we're looking for that wonder everywhere in the world, and we can spin too fast sometimes, take on a little bit too much. We can go to that gluttony place of I want it all. So we often have to learn to be calm and to self-soothe. Type 8s are very powerful in the world. And I think of a tall, strong oak tree when I think of an 8. And yet when you chop a tree down, there's still a big root system there with lots of layers. And people don't often realize how layered 8s are because there's these strong protectors and often military leaders and government officials, and they have all the answers and they're never wrong. And so you do get hard-headed sometimes with 8s, but you understand that that comes with a lot of layering, and they want to protect their people, and they have a very big helper side as well. But they're known as the protectors. And lastly, but not least at all, are our 9s, who sometimes get forgotten. And they are usually known as the peacemakers. Nines are such dreamers in terms of they think about a lot, but they don't say a lot. They merge with people really well. They can tell what others are feeling and thinking. Sometimes you see a great nine as a therapist, or a nine as a great therapist because of that. And so I think a really important thing about whether you're that peacemaking nine or not is if you have a nine in your life who's so kind and peaceful and defers to you for what you're going to do or where you're going to go out to eat, you always want to try to let their voice be heard and give them a few options and let them select from those. If they're not voicing things in an argument, try to make sure you make it safe for them and listen to them. They really want to be heard and listened to above all. So that's the 9 types.
That's great. I love that there's so much variety of types.
Yes.
Lots of variety of people. And
Yes.
I find this really helpful too. When I was a youth, my mom had a book on her bookshelf called The Color Code, which I guess was popular in the late 80s, early 90s. And it broke personalities into like colors. You're red, blue, white, or yellow.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember just reading through it, and they had a little quiz. I answered and got my color or whatever. And
Mm-hmm.
it really helped me, like as a teen, to relate to my parents better, because I had a very red mom and a very blue dad. And I
Wow.
could now see, oh, that's kind of why my mom does what she does, or why my dad does what he does. So is that like the value of understanding these things? Is when you kind of can
Yeah.
understand more of like
Mm-hmm.
your type, your temperament, and
Mm-hmm.
more of your spouse's temperament, and learn more about that. Does it help you relate better, or what's the goal of understanding these things?
Well, I think people love to think about themselves. So that's probably half the fun for a lot of people. But I really am passionate about relationship work. And I know you are too, and helping people to get along better. So what's beautiful about that is, whereas the other systems generally out there are that fun first half I talked about, this system allows for so much more compassion because each type comes with a root fear and an underlying motivation. And so it's really nice when you can say, okay, for instance, my husband's a 1, but I know at the core, he just wants to not be bad. He wants to be good and he wants to be right because he wants to be good, and he has a strong inner critic as a perfectionist. So instead of me getting upset that he's angry, I'm more likely to turn to compassion now that I know that he's a 1 and say, oh my gosh, this guy must be so overworked and overtired, and he's never allowed to rest in his childhood, or wasn't allowed that much. And so now I'm going to be so different as a spouse versus, oh my gosh, I worked so hard too. How come he didn't see that? So it's just beautiful when you can get to the deep levels of each type and start to have compassion.
It sounds like there was there could be a story behind what you just said. Any like specific stories you can share, maybe from your own relationship or from those you know
Yeah.
really well?
Yeah, definitely. We had one right at our honeymoon, and we've been married 20 years at this June. So we didn't even know Enneagram till about year 15. And we were using all of my marriage and family systems training and Gottman and you name it. And then we were doing well, but we could have been doing a lot better. And one example from our honeymoon is we were riding a tandem bicycle, and my husband was in front, and we were in Santa Barbara, California, and we were going up a huge hill to get to the Science Museum. And so he began to feel like he was doing all the work. And I was just like, I'm working really hard. But down the road in marriage, I did learn to work a lot harder because he rubbed off on me. And that was really good for me. But we just huffed and puffed, and we finally decided, I guess we're just going to walk. And it was kind of sad because it's your honeymoon and you're like, I just want to get along the whole time. But then what was so fun, we both really have a strong 7 part of us. And so on the way down the hill, we just had the best time because we'd had such big conflict on the way up. And we were just roaring with joy and, like, of course, going down this huge mountain. And so, so it was very fun to see that there's so many different dynamics at play. That was our
I-
strong 7 part, though.
That's good. Yeah, thank goodness for 7s, right? We need more of them in the world.
Yes, he was able to release his tension too.
So, any other tools that you can use to help couples? I love how you talk about compassion. Like, any other tools you use when working with couples help them kind of understand where their spouse is coming from, so that you can move in with love and compassion and understanding when faced with
Yeah.
conflict and
Mm.
invalidation?
Yeah, the first thing I do after I find out their types is I try to teach them what the underlying issue is. And so when I went through each type, I didn't go through all of those. But for instance, if I was working with a 2, I'd say, gosh, to the spouse, this spouse of yours is worried about abandonment. So even though they act like such a helper, they just want to be assured that you're not going to leave and you're not going to go anywhere. And they sometimes feel like they have to help you, but they get tired of that and resentful if you don't notice that or seem to value it. And then maybe they're married to a 5, an introvert, and then we're right away able to say to the 2, you have to have some compassion for him too, because, and it's usually male, female, not always, but the 2 is usually the female and the 5, the male. And we say, he feels like if he gives any more, he might not make it. Like at his core root fear as a 5 is that not only that he won't be competent in the world, but that he'll run out of energy and disappear. So when a 2 learns that as a helper, they're immediately moved to compassion, and it takes away a lot of the initial worry of, oh my gosh, I called you as a counselor because I was so worried my husband was going to leave me because he was so different. So the Enneagram just really helps when you go down to the depths of each type right from the first session. And then we also try to look at something called subtypes of the Enneagram. Have you heard of those?
I have, but please explain them.
Sure. So if you are just learning your type, the next thing I would do after you kind of understand more about your core issues is I would look at whether you're typically self-preserving, or if you're really a one-to-one person, or if you're a very social person. And I'm giving you a very general label and they get even more nuanced. But what's nice about even just hearing me say that is you get a feel for what they are. The self-preserving people are those who are really wanting to make sure their basic water, food, rest, and money needs are met. And then the one-to-one person just really is that person who feels safest when they are just in one-to-one conversations, especially with their spouse, but also otherwise. And then lastly, the social person has felt like they were really blessed most when they were in a group with safe people. And that's my husband's subtype, because growing up, he shuffled around a lot. And so I learned after we did our Enneagram work, oh my gosh, there's another layer that I can excuse him with because I was judging him for this before. And now I understand he finds his safety in social settings.
And there's also like when you're in a healthy place, you behave more like this, but each one kind of has its shadow. Like when you're in an unhealthy place, you tend to behave this kind of opposite. Like the bad of it comes out instead of the good. That's also part of the more nuanced subtyping too, isn't it?
Well, that's definitely a more nuanced angle of it. Yes, people can say, oh my gosh, this was so helpful because I learned that I thought I was justified in my anger with my spouse. And then I found out that this is not me when I'm at my best. So what's also nice about the Enneagram, like you're saying, is there's gauges for this is what a 1 looks like when they're really upset. This is what a 7 looks like when they're really scattered. But these are what we look like when we're really healthy. So you can look at the health and the stress parts of each type. And you can also look at those subtypes. And what I say about the subtypes is, even if you are socially wired or self-preserving wired or one-to-one wired, the goal is balance between all 3. Because even if when you were a child and your defense mechanisms leaned into one place and that was good for you then, now that you're a healthy adult and you and your spouse are both trying to practice self-care, the best idea is to love others well, love each other well, and love yourselves well too.
Any other tools that you use to help couples better get along, I guess, for lack of a better word?
Sure. Well, I actually use something I call the Enneagram Glow. What I do is I have people typically that work with me read through my pairing booklets. I created pairing booklets for each of the 45 pairings. And in those booklets, I have nuanced help for that pairing. So I talk about their finances, their intimate lives. I definitely have John Gottman tools and emotionally focused therapy tools woven in, since that's my background as well. But I really try to pepper it with very specific tools. So if you're with that 9 peacemaker, one of the things in that booklet says, make sure, and in my work with them, we say, did you hear them? And to the 9, we say, did you run from the conflict, or did you stand up and actually not just become kind of slothful? They can do that. Or did you actually become more vibrant and stand in and say, no, this is my need here. So we work in those spaces sometimes with my glow guides. And the reason I call it the glow is because I believe that when a couple is at their best, it's not just 1+1=2. It's that we truly influence and rub off on each other. And now we have a beautiful new hue together. So we shine out in the world differently. And I help couples to find, well, what are the gifts of a 9-7 or a 1-7 or a 2-5? And what do you guys bring to the world? So what do you help the world socially with, instead of just let's kind of be here in our box of we're mad at each other and we fight sometimes. But okay, well, let's work on that. But let's also work on, what are you guys good at?
I saw those on your website. I can go to your website. You click on Enneagram Glow, I think.
Yeah.
It's called. And I saw all of those, the 45. That's like writing 45 chapters of a book. Must have been a lot of writing and thinking to put that together.
It was, but I'm a self-preserving subtype, so it was really fun. So I just really had a good time. It was a great season of my life. And as a 7, we do reframe everything and rationalize everything to be just fine. But it really was, because it was my self-preserving subtype. So I'm hooked in. I'm guys, I am logged in on my computer. Let me be for a couple of hours, and then I'd pop out and love my family, etc.
How does understanding these things help us move towards better intimacy? Let's talk about intimacy now.
Sure. Yeah. So knowing this, it can really help to say, wait a second, if I know that my spouse is this type, what would be helpful for them? And you can just, even from what I shared, if you know that your spouse is a 3 achiever, then in your intimate life together, that person's going to want to feel like they did a great job, that they satisfied you, and that they are on top of their game. And it's
unintended, right?
Yeah. Yes. And they're hard to get to even hear that things weren't perfect, because they feel bad. So you have to work with them. They're very kind of, people think, oh, they're so strong on the outside and they can be harsh, but they're very soft and sensitive on the inside. So when you tell a 3, for instance, you do need to work on this area, you've got to also help that couple, or if you're the spouse, really be able to say a lot of compliments too. Here's what I do love about you. But it's different for each of the types. And for example, a 5 might be exhausted. A 6, as a worrier and a planner, may want to know ahead of time so things can be clean, prepared, so that they can create exit strategies for afterwards if they're tired. And there's so many nuances that you have to pay attention to in the intimate world with these types.
Gotcha. So instead of being so frustrated that you don't like to be intimate the way I do, you can now, it's more like it's kung fu now, right? You can move with it, move with them, and create something that works great for both of you. And that's what the value of learning Enneagram typing and your spouse's tendencies and temperament and personality is.
Yes, I'm so with you. And there's several, 3 of the types are body types, 3 of them are head types, and 3 of them are heart types. So when if you study it with a coach or with your counselor, or you really get into reading about it, you realize, oh, wow, my spouse just wanted their heart to be loved. Like I said, with that 3 who may seem so harsh on the outside, but really they're a heart type. Or a 7 or a 5 is a head type. And you're like, oh, they're in their head all the time. No wonder they're not talking to me during intimacy, because they're in their head. So for that spouse, you may say, okay, can you talk to me? And then for the body types, they may just be so cut and dry and so logical about it that they may forget the heart or the thinking. So it's fun to be able to not just, like you said, accuse your spouse, but to learn who they are and to try to find new game plans.
That's great. Game plans. I love it. Have you thought about how sex and Enneagram work together? We've talked about intimacy in general, but what are your thoughts on that?
I think that when it comes really down to it, a lot of the techniques that people use for relaxation beforehand are so helpful, because a lot of people are thinking, now that I've learned the Enneagram and I found out you're so different from me in the sexual arena, I would really like to now I feel almost like a stranger with you. So they have to do some sensate focus or another just basic relaxation exercise to say, let's start fresh. Let's just talk about our sex life instead of just trying to do these nonverbals that are awkward. And let's just admit that it's awkward for everybody when we aren't communicating very well. And so they may start with some basic relaxation and conversations that are a little less judgy now. Okay, now that I learned that you're in your head a lot and you may fear being overwhelmed, when are you most energetic? And so in my programs, I have a release book that I've written. I have a whole chapter on sex. And as I said, in my Enneagram Glow guides, I talk about, make sure you talk about this so that you can get back to those nuances that sometimes we do on our honeymoon period. And we just need to revisit that every few years, as I'm sure you'll agree.
Yep. Very often.
Yes.
That's good. If people want to learn more, like, are there quizzes they can take online or apps they can download to help them better understand who they are in reference to the Enneagram?
You know what? That's a great question. And it is not a simple answer because apparently, if you really want to talk to one of the top Enneagram gurus, the people who have been doing this for 20 to 30 years, they remind us that there's no shortcuts, that if you really want to know your type, the best way to do it is to read about it and to learn about it. And when you find the one that seems like somebody opened your mail, and you may have to get down to the nitty gritty, you may have to look at the subtype even and type in on the internet to a site that's reputable, self-preserving 5, and then you could look it up and do each one. Beatrice Chestnut has a great website where she talks about all the types and the subtypes if you can't find yours within the 9. But after reading about it, when one feels like I've just opened my own mail, it's so embarrassing, or somebody else just opened my mail, then I am going to share it hopefully with my spouse, and now we can be on our way. Now, what I do is I'm a 7. I like a shortcut. I take my clients to tests, and I take them to truity.com. I take them to another site that I really like that is called yourchristianenneagramcoach.com. I have another site that I really like, which gives you your top 3 types, your head type, your heart type, and your body type. I just referred somebody to that today, and it gives you your subtype, and that's at Catherine Favre. So I can give you those for your show links, but I really like the test because after I see a couple of signs and I'm starting to see a narrowing of what my type probably is, then I can read about it and then I can see, is that the fit? So I use both.
Any other tips you want to share with our listeners? Anything else you want to, relationship advice that you've come to learn yourself over the years, working with many couples and working in this space with all your training?
Sure. I just love for people to be as generous as possible to their spouses. I think that when we do our own work and we get our own self-care, our spouses tend to follow suit and learn from our health. And what I really want to encourage your listeners is not to just start Enneagramming their spouse and saying, aha, I've discovered that you're a 4 and this is why you're always in a bad mood. But instead, really just talk about your own discoveries, either in your self-care or marriage studies or Enneagram studies, and just be insightful and say something humble. Like, I've learned this about myself and it was really important for me to learn this. Generally speaking, your spouse is like, I already knew that about you. And so then when you go there with them, they're a lot more willing to be intimate with you in an emotional way so that they can say, you know what, I'd like to see that book you're reading or the quiz you took, because I want to do some growing. I've noticed some changes in you. So that's my best advice, is start changing, start getting balanced, start getting healthy, and then they'll see that.
Gotcha. And it's not to manipulate or cajole or like,
No.
now I figured out your magic button or whatever. It's nothing like that.
Yeah, because we don't know the depth. Sometimes it takes people years to find out their actual type because they're like, I took a quiz and it said this, or I thought my spouse looked like this type. And then years later, they tell you, actually, I am a 5. My biggest fear is lack of competency and that my energy will run out. And so you thought all this time they were an 8, but they weren't. So just be careful of typing others and just show a lot of grace, but show self-respect too, because you're important too, and you need to have love as well.
If people want to reach out to you, where's the best place for them to find you?
They can find me by
We
going
hope that
to
you enjoyed
Apple
this episode
Podcasts
of Get Your
listening to
Marriage
the
On.
Enneagram
And if you
Marriage
did, we
podcast
would
I
love
have,
it if
or
you
they
would
could
take a
just
few
go right
seconds
to my
to give us a
website,
rating on iTunes and to share the show with your friends.
and have a
They'll
very
thank you for
basic
life.
overview of each
Once
of the
you've done
9
that,
types.
you can head over
And
to
I also have the glow guides I
getyourmarriageon.com for
mentioned
more
in each of the
resources about
podcasts there.
today's topic and to download our amazing marriage apps. Now go get your marriage on.